Hey guys, let's see what the Wild Robot's up to today. We are at chapter 56, Spring. Big things are happening. Dripping water, floating water, splashing water, winter's blanket of snow and ice was finally begun to melt, while fading away and exposed the grays and browns that had been hidden beneath. Little green buds were appearing all over. Crowds of bright flowers were rising up from the dirt, and soon the island would be bustling with rich scents and colors, at long last spring was here. The lodgers returned to their own homes. The hibernators emerged from their secret places, and Roz roamed the island and checked in with the beavers and the bears and all the friends she'd missed. Then the robot went home to work in a garden. After the bitterest winter anyone could ever recall, life was slowly returning to normal. However, it was quiet spring. There were fewer insects buzzing, fewer birds singing, and fewer rodents rumbling. Many creatures had frozen to death over the winter, and the last of the snow had melted away. Their corpses were slowly revealed. The wilderness really can be an ugly place sometimes, but out of that ugliness came beauty. You see, those poor dead creatures returned to the earth. Their bodies nourished the soil, and that helped create the most dazzling spring bloom the island had ever known. Chapter 60, The Fish. Help! Help! He's got my tail! Paddler was splashing and screaming in the pond. Roz and Mr. Beaver were now nowhere to be seen, and Roz picked up a fallen tree branch and stomped into the shallows. "Grab onto this," she said as she reached out to the branch. Paddler grabbed the branch with his big teeth, and the robot lifted him out of the water. And there, hanging from the young beaver's tail, was Rockmouth, the grumpy old pike. In one quick movement, Roz pulled in the branch and gripped the fish with her two hands. Paddler flopped into the water, where his parents suddenly appeared. "What is wrong with you, Rockmouth?" Mrs. Beaver dragged her son away. "You've always been a nuisance, but this time you've gone too far. Do us a favor, Roz. Toss him to the vultures." "I cannot do that," said Roz, "but I might be able to help." Roz placed Rockmouth in the deep puddle near the pond where he couldn't swim away, and she waited for the fish to explain himself. Fish aren't always talkative, especially grumpy fish like Rockmouth, but eventually he opened up to the robot, and before long he was waving for the beavers to join them. "Rockmouth used to live in the river," said Roz, as the beavers shuttled over. But you trapped him here when you built the dam. He was very angry about it ever since." "That doesn't give him the right to attack my son," hollered Mr. Beaver. "It most certainly does not," hollered Mrs. Beaver. "I am upset now, too," Paddler said softly. "I hate to be kept away from my home. Mr. Rockmouth, you should have said something sooner." The fish looked up from the puddle and with a frustrated expression that meant, "I tried to, but no one was listening." Well, the situation had to be remedied. And can you guess who rose to the occasion? Roz was determined to get Rockmouth back to his home, and she explored the nearby waterways. It became clear that she would have to carry the pike through the forest and across the green meadow to the nearest bend in the river. "I need a large container," said Roz to the beavers, "something I can fill with water so Rockmouth can breathe while I carry him home. I could make it myself, but I thought you might like to help." It could have been easy to overcome her anger with Rockmouth, but after Mrs. Beaver had a chance to cool down, she finally came around. "I suppose you're partly to blame for this whole situation," she muttered. The beavers did the right thing, and together they carved out the wooden barrel for a fish. "Here you go." Mrs. Beaver rolled the barrel over to the puddle, and when the robot and the fish were waiting, "This should work nicely, Rockmouth, and I hope you're back in the river." Rockmouth just flicked his tail in a way that meant, "Will somebody please take me home now?" Roz flipped the barrel of the water and the grumpy fish, and then they were off. She carried Rockmouth through the forest and across the meadow until she was standing on the riverbank. "Welcome home," said the robot, and then she tipped the barrel, and the fish plunked into the river. Rockmouth's face poked above the surface. He splashed a big toothy grin, and then quickly swam away. Chapter 61, The Robot Stories. The story of how Roz helped Rockmouth spread throughout the river and across the land, and it soon was followed by other robot stories. There were stories of Roz growing gardens in dry, barren places. There were stories of Roz nursing sick animals back to health. There were stories of Roz clearing ropes with wheels and tools for helping their friends. There were new stories were about the robot wilderness. You see, Roz had noticed the wilder she acted, the more the animals liked her. And so she barked with the foxes, and sang with the birds, and hissed with the snakes. She romped with the weasels, she sunbathed with the lizards, she leaped with the deer. The spring was a very wild time for the robot. Chapter 62, The Return. It was a quiet afternoon on the pond. The quiet was gradually overtaken by the sounds heard for many months. The sound grew louder, and a flock of geese appeared above the trees. Honk, honk, honk. Most flocks of geese move lazily through the sky and trail off in wobbly lines, but not this one. This flock was fast. It flew in a perfect V formation, and it was led by a small, graceful goose. The flock flew once around the pond before gliding down and gently splashing into the water. These geese gathered in a tight group in the middle of the pond. They floated for a while, softly honking to one another, and then their leader broke away from the others. He swam through the nest, toward the nest, waddled into the garden, and fluttered up to his mother's shoulder. "Welcome home, son," said Roz. "It's good to be back, Ma," said Brightbill. Chapter 63, The Journey. After months of separation, Roz and Brightbill, mother and son, were together again. They had so much catching up to do. They went to the nest, and the robot built a fire. But the goose gazed into the flames and told the story of the winter. This is what he said. "We spent the whole first day on our migration flight over the ocean. It seemed like the ocean would go on forever, but just when a flock was getting tired, Longneck pointed to some tiny islands on the horizon. We flew down to one of the islands and ate dune grass and rested our wings. After a few days, we were hopping from island to island, and we reached the mainland, and we continued over the fields and forests, and then the snow began to fall. We'd never seen snow before. And at first I thought it was beautiful, and then just kept coming. The others explained that snow was early, and they were never supposed to see it. But there it was, piling around us. We tried to sleep at night. Longneck worried that the great weakest goose wouldn't survive, and he was right. We lost old Whitefoot on that first snowstorm. We tried to fly around the snowy weather, but we got completely lost, and the weather became even worse. Lakes and ponds and rivers began freezing over. We couldn't find food or water. We ate snow, and now that made us colder. And we had trouble cleaning ourselves, and our feathers became dirty and heavy, and the flock was in bad shape, and Loudwig kept us moving. 'We're geese,' he squawked. 'We keep moving.' One day, we were struggling through the snow shower when we saw what's called a farm. It had perfectly square fields and an enormous building. Its stomping their way through the farm was a robot. It just looked just like you, Ma. Longneck sent me over to speak to the robot, and I couldn't understand anything she said, so I followed her through the farm and around the corner, and then I saw something I never expected. Plants, bright, beautiful colors, and I didn't expect how many plants could live in such cold weather. But then I saw that there was actually inside a building. I learned later the building was called a greenhouse, and it was clear walls made of something called glass. And the robot pressed a small button, and the door slid open, and warm air came rushing out. And I hadn't felt warmth in so long, I just had to follow her inside. Ma, it was like summer in there. The air was warm and sweet and sticky, and there were rows and rows of different plants, and the robots didn't pay attention to me, so I wandered around the greenhouse, nibbling on leaves and drinking from puddles, and then I heard a scratchy voice behind me. If I were younger, I would have killed you by now. I spun around, and there was an old cat. She walked on stiff legs, and her fur was gray and clumpy, and the cat's name was Snooks, and she didn't seem very nice. But then she saw the geese out in the cold with their faces in the glass. She told me how to open the door. 'You can rest here,' said Snooks, 'but stay out of sight. The humans aren't as friendly as me.' None of us knew what humans were, but we didn't care. We just were happy to be out of the cold. Loudwig was so happy, she cried. The flocks drank and ate and bathed and slept and stayed out of the way. Snook showed us to leave our droppings so we wouldn't be noticed. And for a few days, the greenhouse was our home. Only once or twice a day, the robot would go outside and return with a big bag. Most of the time, she'd stay inside and quietly work on the plants. there was a barn that I just had to explore. It was filled with animals and machines and piles of straw, and it had two robots. One robot was fixing a broken door when I walked in, and she was using a loud spinning tool called a saw. And then she pushed me through a long piece of wood, and the dust shot everywhere. Everything was going smoothly until suddenly lurched forward and sliced right through 3 of the robot's fingers. But she was fine. A minute later, there was a thwop sound, and she plopped on a new hand. And then she went right back to work using the saw again. The older robots worked with the animals, chickens, sheep, pigs, and cows, and they were all in cages. And the chickens kept asking me how I'd gotten out of my cage, and I was explaining that I never had a cage. Where I'd heard panic squawking coming from the greenhouse. I ran back and found the human and discovered the flock. We didn't know what she was saying, but she looked really angry. Loudwing tried to defend us. He got in front and spread his wings and honked, but the human wasn't afraid. He pulled out the shiny stick and pointed it right at Loudneck. Snooks hissed, "Look out, he's got a rifle!" Suddenly, a bright beam of light shot from the rifle, and Longneck slumped to the floor. He was dead, Ma! The flock was so scared. We fluttered around and honked and knocked over the plants, but the human kept moving toward us, pointing his rifle. So I pecked at the human to open the door, and we ran outside, and then into the cold, and we flew away from there as fast as we could. Without Longneck, the flock needed a new leader, and everyone wanted me to lead, and I didn't know what to do. So I started repeating Loudneck's words. I squawked, "We are geese, and geese keep going." And then I took point, and the flock spread out behind me. The weather had us all turned around, and nobody knew which way to go, so I just had led us straight south. We saw many robots and humans and buildings, but we didn't stop. We knew that we were way off course when we saw the ocean again, but at least it was a little warmer by the water, so I decided to follow the coastline for a while. And there were more buildings by the coast. Most of them were on land, but some of them were in the ocean. The ocean buildings were dirty and crumbly and leaning in different directions. There weren't any humans or robots in those buildings, only sea creatures. We saw ships in the water. Saw ships in the land. We even saw ships in the air. They buzzed through like giant dragonflies. And then when we reached this place called the city, where thousands of buildings and robots and humans and ships all came together, there we stopped to rest on the rooftop. We met a friendly pigeon named Grayback. She had grown up there, and she knew everything about the city. She flew to the towers under the bridge and kept us away from the buzzing airships. And everywhere we went, there were robots. Some of them city robots just like you, Ma, but others crawled on 6 legs or rolled on wheels or slid up and down the sides of buildings. Some robots were really small, and some were really big. They moved things and cleaned things and built things and did every kind of job you can think of. Grayback brought us down to the ledge of the side of the building and told us to look in through the windows. Inside was a family of humans, and they had a Roz robot. When we were looking in the buildings, we saw other humans with other robots, and every human seemed to have a robot. I told Grayback about you, Ma, and she wanted to show us one last place. We flew to the edge of the city, and there was a really big building called a factory. And Grayback brought us to the roof, to the windows, and we looked into the factory, and we saw machines building sparkling heads and torsos and limbs. The factory was building robots. Machines helped the robot torso and put the legs under it and snapped it into place. It put feet under it and snapped it into place and snapped arms and shoulders, and the head was snapped on top, and the robot was finished. Ma, the robot just looked just like you. I think that's the factory where you were built. I wanted to watch more robots build, but it started to snow again, so we said goodbye, and Grayback continued flying south. The air became warmer, the snow disappeared, we started seeing other flocks of geese, so we followed them to the middle of the wide grassy field. After all we'd been through together, our flock had become close. We kept ourselves eating and resting and remembering the geese we'd lost. But after a few weeks, we began to mingle with the other flocks. And we met these geese from all over the world, and they told us about their homes and their migrations and their troubles and the weather, and every flock had lost geese along the way. A few flocks didn't make it at all, but before we knew it, it was early spring flowers were poking up, and it was time to fly home. We followed the usual migration route towards the north and flew over the fields and the forests and the hills that didn't see any sign of humans or robots, and that was fine with us. And eventually we reached the ocean, and then I saw you.